I watched in disbelief as the massive billboard truck pulled up to the corner of Maple Street. The workers began unloading the vinyl banner that would change everything. My hands trembled as I held the final proof in my hands. There she was, captured in perfect high definition. Karen Mitchell, HOA board member, license plate clearly visible, cutting across my lawn like she owned it. For 3 months, she had turned my beautiful front yard into her personal shortcut to the elementary school. 3 months of tire tracks, dead grass, and complete disrespect for my property. 3 months of her entitled smirk every time I tried to confront her about it. But now, every parent, every neighbor, every commuter who drove down this busy school route would see exactly what kind of person Karen Mitchell really was. The billboard would be up for 30 days during peak traffic hours. That was when I realized, sometimes the best revenge is simply letting everyone see the truth. My morning routine had become sacred over the past 2 years. Every day at 6:30, I would step onto my front porch with a steaming cup of coffee and survey my small piece of suburban paradise. The lawn stretched out before me like a green carpet, each blade of grass a testament to countless hours of careful attention. I had spent every weekend for the past 8 months nursing that lawn back to health. The previous owners had let it go completely, leaving behind patches of weeds and bare dirt that looked more like a construction site than a front yard. But I saw potential where others saw problems. Saturday mornings were for fertilizing. Sunday afternoons were for watering and edging. Wednesday evenings were for spot treatments and overseeding. The neighbors had started to notice. Mrs. Henderson from across the street complimented me just last week on how much the curb appeal had improved. Even the mail carrier, Dave, mentioned that my house was becoming the prettiest one on the block. I felt proud in a way that surprised me. There was something deeply satisfying about creating beauty from nothing. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The sun was just beginning to peek over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the dew-covered grass. I took my usual spot on the porch steps, coffee in hand, and breathed in the crisp autumn air. The street was quiet except for the occasional jogger or dog walker heading toward the park. Then I heard it, the roar of an engine accelerating hard, followed by the unmistakable sound of tires spinning on wet grass. I looked up just in time to see a massive black SUV cutting diagonally across my front lawn, spraying dirt and grass clippings in every direction. The vehicle bounced violently as it hit the small decorative border stones I had carefully placed around my flower bed. I sat frozen, coffee mug halfway to my lips, watching this stranger destroy months of work in a matter of seconds. Deep tire ruts carved through the grass like scars. Chunks of sod flew through the air. The carefully maintained edge along my sidewalk was completely torn up. The SUV lurched back onto the street without even slowing down, heading toward the elementary school 2 blocks away. I caught a glimpse of the driver as she passed under the streetlight. A woman with short blonde hair and oversized sunglasses, talking on her phone like nothing had happened. She looked directly at me sitting on my porch, made brief eye contact, and then looked away without any expression of apology or concern. I stood up slowly, still holding my coffee, and walked to the edge of my property. The damage was even worse up close. 2 deep ruts ran diagonally across the lawn, each about 6 inches wide and 2 inches deep. The grass was not just bent or damaged. It was completely torn up, leaving bare patches of mud and exposed roots. I knelt down and touched one of the ruts with my finger. The earth was soft and torn like an open wound. All those weekends, all those hours of careful work, all those early mornings checking the sprinkler system and pulling weeds by hand, gone in less than 10 seconds. I looked toward the school and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The street was perfectly clear. There was no traffic, no emergency, no reason for anyone to cut across private property. The woman had simply decided that my lawn was her personal shortcut, and she had taken it without a second thought. I walked back to my porch and sat down heavily on the steps. My coffee had gone cold, but I barely noticed. I kept staring at the tire tracks, hoping somehow they would disappear or that I had imagined the whole thing. But the evidence was right there in front of me, carved into the ground like a permanent reminder that some people simply do not care about other people's property. That was the moment my perfect morning routine ended forever. From that day forward, I would never again be able to sit on my porch and admire my lawn without thinking about what Karen Mitchell had done to it. 3 days later, it happened again. Same black SUV, same reckless path, same complete disregard for my property. This time I was ready. I had positioned myself by the front window with my phone, determined to get a clear photo of the license plate and the driver. The SUV came barreling down Maple Street at exactly 7:45 in the morning. I watched as it veered off the road and onto my lawn without even slowing down. The driver followed the exact same path as before, using the existing tire ruts like a personal driveway. Mud splattered across my front porch as the heavy vehicle bounced through the damaged grass. I managed to capture several photos through the window, including a clear shot of the license plate, HMD 7492. The driver was the same woman from Tuesday, still talking on her phone, still acting like she owned the neighborhood. As she pulled back onto the street, I noticed something that made my blood boil. She was smiling. This was not an accident. This was not an emergency. This was a deliberate choice to use my property as her personal shortcut to avoid the morning traffic around the school. She had found the fastest route from her house to the elementary school drop-off line, and my lawn was apparently part of that route. I decided to confront her directly. The next morning, I positioned myself at the end of my driveway with a clear view of both directions. At exactly 7:43, I saw the black SUV approaching from the north. I stepped into the street and waved my arms, hopping to get her attention before she could veer onto my lawn. She saw me and slowed down, but instead of stopping, she simply drove around me and continued onto my grass. I jogged alongside her vehicle, tapping on the passenger window. She finally stopped and rolled down the window about 2 inches. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "You just drove across my lawn. This is private property." She looked at me with obvious annoyance, like I was interrupting something important. "The traffic is backed up around the school," she said. "I am just trying to get my kids to school on time." "I understand that," I replied, "but you are damaging my lawn. You cannot just drive across other people's property." She stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "It is just grass," she said. "It will grow back." Before I could respond, she rolled up the window and drove away, leaving me standing in the street with my mouth hanging open. Just grass. Months of work, hundreds of dollars in materials, countless hours of care and attention. Just grass. That afternoon, I decided to do some research. I started with the license plate number and discovered that the SUV was registered to Karen Mitchell at 47 Oakwood Drive. A quick search revealed that she was not just any neighbor. She was a member of the Willowbrook HOA Board of Directors. This explained everything. Karen Mitchell was used to being in charge, used to making rules for other people to follow. She probably thought her position on the HOA board gave her some kind of special privilege to do whatever she wanted in the neighborhood. I spent the next hour reading through the HOA website and bylaws. I found Karen's profile on the board member page, complete with a professional headshot and a description of her commitment to maintaining community standards. The irony was almost too much to bear. Over the next week, the pattern became undeniable. Every single morning at 7:45, Karen would drive across my lawn on her way to the school. She had turned my property into her personal traffic bypass. The damage was accumulating rapidly. What had started as two simple tire ruts was now a muddy mess that stretched across the entire front section of my lawn. I started documenting everything with photos and notes. Tuesday, two new ruts near the mailbox. Wednesday, damage to the flower bed border. Thursday, deep gouges that went all the way down to the clay subsoil. Friday, tire marks on my sidewalk where she had driven too close to the house. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Henderson asked me what had happened to my beautiful lawn. I explained the situation, and her face went pale. "That is Karen Mitchell," she said. "She has been causing problems in this neighborhood for years. She thinks she can do whatever she wants because she is on the HOA board." That was when I realized I was not dealing with a simple case of inconsiderate driving. I was dealing with someone who had been systematically abusing her power and position for years, and my lawn was just her latest victim. By the end of the second week, Karen had invited friends to join her morning shortcut routine. I watched in horror as not one, but three different vehicles cut across my lawn during the morning school rush. A red minivan, a white pickup truck, and Karen's black SUV formed a small convoy of destruction that turned my front yard into a muddy parking lot. My morning coffee ritual had become a daily nightmare. Instead of peaceful contemplation, I spent every sunrise watching for incoming vehicles and trying to document the damage. I had filled an entire notebook with dates, times, license plate numbers, and detailed descriptions of each incident. The photos on my phone showed the progressive destruction of everything I had worked so hard to create. The weather made everything worse. October brought several days of heavy rain, and the repeated tire traffic turned my lawn into a swamp. What had started as simple tire ruts became deep trenches that filled with standing water. The grass was not just damaged anymore. It was completely dead, leaving behind patches of bare mud that looked like open wounds across my property. I calculated the financial cost one evening after work. The original lawn renovation had cost me nearly $800 in materials, not counting the dozens of hours I had invested in labor. The new damage would require complete restoration: new sod, fresh topsoil, replacement border stones, and probably professional grading to fix the drainage problems. The estimate came to over $1,500. But the money was not the worst part. The worst part was the complete disrespect, the casual dismissal of my rights as a property owner. Every morning, I watched Karen and her friends treat my lawn like their personal roadway, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I decided to take the matter to the HOA board. I spent an entire evening preparing a formal complaint, complete with photos, documentation, and a detailed timeline of events. I submitted it through the proper channels and requested a meeting to discuss the situation. The response came back within 2 days. Karen Mitchell herself had signed the letter, explaining that the HOA had no authority over traffic patterns or individual driving behavior. She suggested that I contact the police if I believed a crime had been committed. The letter concluded with a reminder that maintaining attractive curb appeal was every homeowner's responsibility under the community standards. I read that letter 3 times, each time feeling my anger rise to a new level. Karen was not just ignoring my complaint. She was actively blocking any resolution while continuing to destroy my property. Her position on the HOA board was giving her complete immunity from consequences. The final straw came on a Saturday morning. I was working in my garage when I heard the familiar sound of tires on wet grass. I looked outside to see Karen's SUV cutting across my lawn, even though there was no school traffic to avoid. She was using my property as a shortcut to reach the grocery store on the other side of the neighborhood. This time, she had driven too close to the house and completely destroyed the small flower bed I had planted along the front porch. Bright orange marigolds and deep purple petunias that I had carefully tended for months were now crushed under tire tracks. Potting soil was scattered across the sidewalk. The decorative border stones were cracked and displaced. I stood in my driveway, looking at the destruction, and felt something break inside me. This was not just about property damage anymore. This was about power, respect, and the right to exist peacefully in my own home. Karen Mitchell had declared war on me, and she was winning because I was trying to fight fair while she was cheating with impunity. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done playing by the rules that only applied to me. I was done being the victim of someone else's sense of entitlement. I was done watching my property be destroyed while the person responsible faced no consequences. I opened my laptop and began researching property law, trespass violations, and legal remedies for property damage. I spent hours reading about surveillance systems, documentation requirements, and civil litigation procedures. I researched local attorneys who specialized in property disputes and neighborhood conflicts. But most importantly, I researched Karen Mitchell. I wanted to understand exactly who I was dealing with and what kind of person could treat a neighbor with such complete disrespect. What I found made me realize that my lawn was just the beginning. Karen had a long history of using her HOA position to bully and intimidate other homeowners in the neighborhood. The time for polite requests and formal complaints had passed. Karen Mitchell was about to learn that actions have consequences, and some people fight back harder than others. I spent the next 3 days diving deep into property law research. I discovered that what Karen was doing was not just rude or inconsiderate. It was illegal. Repeated trespass on private property, especially when it caused damage, could result in both criminal charges and civil liability. The fact that she was doing it deliberately and regularly made it even worse. I contacted 3 different attorneys who specialized in property disputes. 2 of them were not interested in taking on a case involving lawn damage. But the third one, Sarah Chen, listened to my story with growing interest. She asked me to send her all my documentation and photos, and she promised to review everything over the weekend. While I waited for her response, I decided to install a security camera system. I had been thinking about home security for months anyway, and this situation gave me the perfect excuse to finally pull the trigger. I wanted crystal clear evidence of every single violation. I spent Saturday morning at the electronics store, talking to the security specialist about different camera options. I explained that I needed something that could capture license plates and faces clearly, even in low light conditions. I also needed enough storage capacity to record several weeks of footage without overwriting important evidence. The specialist recommended a 4-camera system with night vision and motion detection. The cameras would connect to a central recording unit in my basement, and I could monitor everything from my phone or computer. The total cost was $800, but I considered it an investment in justice. Sunday was installation day. I mounted one camera under the front porch eave, aimed directly at the spot where Karen usually cut across my lawn. A second camera went on the garage, providing a wider angle view of the entire front yard. The third camera covered my driveway and the street, and the fourth camera watched the side yard where some of the other vehicles had been cutting through. As I worked on the installation, several neighbors stopped by to see what I was doing. Mrs. Henderson brought me a glass of iced tea and asked if I was having security problems. I explained the situation with Karen and the lawn damage, and she shook her head in disgust. "That woman has been causing problems since the day she moved in," she said. "She got the Thompson family cited for having their garbage cans out too early. She complained about the Johnsons' dog barking during the day. She even tried to get the Martinez family in trouble for planting vegetables in their backyard." Other neighbors shared similar stories. Karen had used her HOA position to file complaints about everything from lawn ornaments to house paint colors. She seemed to take pleasure in finding violations and forcing people to comply with her interpretation of the community standards. By Sunday evening, my camera system was fully operational. I had clear views of my entire front yard, and the motion detection would alert me to any activity. I spent an hour testing different angles and settings, making sure I could capture license plates and faces clearly. Monday morning at 7:45, Karen's black SUV appeared right on schedule. I watched from my kitchen window as she turned off the street and onto my lawn, following her usual path through the muddy ruts. But this time, I was ready. The camera captured everything in perfect high definition. Her license plate was clearly visible as she approached my property. Her face was clearly visible through the windshield as she made eye contact with my front door. The damage to my lawn was clearly visible as her tires churned through the mud and dead grass. I downloaded the footage and watched it several times, feeling a sense of satisfaction I had not experienced in weeks. This was not she said anymore. This was undeniable video evidence of deliberate property destruction. The same thing happened Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Each incident was captured in perfect detail. I now had a growing library of evidence that showed a clear pattern of repeated trespass and property damage. But Karen was apparently not finished escalating the situation. On Friday morning, I watched as she approached my lawn and then suddenly slammed on her brakes. She had noticed the cameras. She sat in her SUV for nearly 30 seconds, staring directly at the camera under my porch. Then she slowly drove around to the street side of my property and parked her vehicle directly in front of my driveway, blocking my access to the street. I watched from my window as she sat in her car, talking on her phone and periodically glancing at my house. She was not just trying to get to school anymore. She was actively trying to intimidate me into backing down. That afternoon, I received a call from Sarah Chen, the attorney I had contacted earlier. She had reviewed my documentation and video evidence, and she had some very good news. Karen's behavior clearly constituted criminal trespass and property damage. I had grounds for both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. But Sarah had an even better idea. "Before we go to court," she said, "let me make a few phone calls. Sometimes the threat of legal action is enough to solve these problems without expensive litigation." I agreed to let her try the diplomatic approach first, but privately, I was already planning my next move. If Karen wanted to escalate this conflict, I was ready to take it to a level she would never forget. The cameras had been recording for 2 weeks, and the evidence was overwhelming. I had captured 23 separate incidents of Karen cutting across my lawn, each one documented with date, time, and crystal-clear video footage. But what made the evidence even more compelling was Karen's evolving behavior on camera. During the first week after the cameras were installed, she had been cautious and defensive. She would glance nervously at the cameras as she drove across my lawn, sometimes slowing down or taking a slightly different path. But by the second week, her behavior had completely changed. She was no longer trying to hide what she was doing. Instead, she seemed to be performing for the cameras. On Wednesday morning, she had driven directly toward the front porch camera and stopped her SUV just a few feet away from my house. She rolled down her window, looked directly into the camera lens, and flipped me off with both hands. She held that pose for nearly 10 seconds, making sure the camera captured her message clearly. Thursday morning was even worse. She brought her teenage son with her, and I watched as she pointed at my cameras and said something that made him laugh. Then they both gestured rudely at the cameras before driving away. She was not just trespassing on my property anymore. She was teaching her children that this kind of behavior was acceptable. I compiled all the footage into a single video file, organized chronologically with date and time stamps. The progression was clear, from nervous trespassing to deliberate provocation to outright hostility. Any reasonable person watching this video would see exactly what kind of person Karen Mitchell was. But I wanted to do more than just document the problem. I wanted to solve it permanently. I spent hours researching different options for public accountability. I looked into local newspaper coverage, social media campaigns, and community bulletin boards. Nothing seemed quite right for the level of impact I was hoping to achieve. That was when I noticed the billboard. I had driven past it hundreds of times on my way to work, but I had never really paid attention to it before. It stood at the corner of Maple Street and Jefferson Avenue, right along the main route that parents used to get to the elementary school. The current advertisement was for a local insurance company, but it was clearly a rotating display that changed every few weeks. I pulled over and found the contact information for the billboard company. I called them that afternoon and spoke to a sales representative named Mike. He explained that they rented the space in monthly blocks, and the current slot was available starting the 1st of November. The cost was $2,500 for a 1-month display. "What kind of advertisement are you looking to put up?" Mike asked. I explained that I wanted to create a public service announcement about property rights and neighborhood courtesy. I did not go into the specific details, but I made it clear that I had my own graphic design and that I just needed the billboard space. "We do have content guidelines," Mike said. "Nothing offensive, nothing that could be considered harassment or defamation. Do you have the artwork ready for review?" I told him I would send it over by the end of the week. After I hung up, I sat in my car staring at that billboard and imagining what it would look like. Every parent driving to school would see it. Every neighbor would see it. Every commuter who used this route would see it. Most importantly, Karen Mitchell would see it every single day. I spent the next 2 days working on the design. I wanted something that was clear, factual, and impossible to ignore. I started with a high-resolution screenshot from my security footage showing Karen's black SUV cutting across my lawn. Her license plate was clearly visible, and the damage to my property was obvious. The headline read, "Respect private property." Below that, in smaller text, "This HOA board member uses her neighbor's lawn as her personal shortcut to school." At the bottom, I included the date and time stamp from the video footage, along with a QR code that linked to a website where people could view the complete video evidence. I sent the design to Mike for approval, along with a written statement explaining that everything in the advertisement was factually accurate and supported by video evidence. I also included a copy of Sarah Chen's legal opinion confirming that the content was not defamatory or harassing. Mike called me back the next day with approval. "This is definitely unusual," he said, "but everything looks legal and factual. We can have it up by November 1st if you want to proceed with payment." I authorized the payment immediately. $2,500 was a lot of money, but I considered it the best investment I had ever made. Karen Mitchell was about to learn that her actions had consequences, and those consequences were going to be very, very public. While I waited for the billboard to go live, Karen continued her daily routine of trespassing and property destruction. But now, I noticed that other neighbors were paying attention too. Mrs. Henderson had started taking photos from her front window. The couple who lived 2 houses down had begun walking their dog past my house every morning at 7:45, just in time to witness Karen's daily violation. Word was spreading through the neighborhood about what Karen was doing. People were talking about it at the grocery store, at the post office, and at the school pickup line. Karen Mitchell was becoming famous, and not in a good way. But she had no idea what was coming. The billboard would go live in 3 days, and her private bad behavior was about to become very public knowledge. November 1st arrived with perfect autumn weather. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and excellent visibility for anyone driving down Maple Street. I had set my alarm for 6:30 that morning, wanting to be awake when the billboard company finished their overnight installation. I made my coffee and stepped onto my front porch just as the sun was coming up. There it was, impossible to miss. A massive 20-foot by 10-foot display featuring Karen Mitchell's black SUV cutting across my lawn in high-definition color. The image was so clear you could read her license plate from 2 blocks away. I stood there sipping my coffee and admiring the billboard for nearly 20 minutes. Cars were already slowing down as they drove past, with drivers and passengers pointing and taking photos with their phones. A few people even pulled over to get a better look and scan the QR code with their phones. At exactly 7:45, I saw Karen's SUV approaching from the north. I positioned myself on my front porch with my coffee cup, wanting to have the best possible view of her reaction. I had been waiting for this moment for over a month. Karen was talking on her phone as usual, not paying attention to anything around her. She was about 50 yards away from the billboard when she finally looked up and saw it. I watched as her SUV swerved slightly, then came to a complete stop in the middle of the street. She sat there for nearly 30 seconds, staring at the billboard in apparent shock. I could see her face clearly from my porch, and the expression was everything I had hoped for. Confusion, then recognition, then absolute fury. She looked like someone had just thrown a bucket of ice water in her face. Other cars were backing up behind her, honking their horns and trying to get around her stopped vehicle. She finally drove forward, but instead of cutting across my lawn like she had every other morning, she continued straight down the street toward the school. For the first time in over a month, my lawn was safe. But Karen was not finished. About 10 minutes later, her SUV came roaring back up Maple Street, and she pulled into my driveway so aggressively that her tires squealed. She jumped out of her car and marched up to my front door, pounding on it with her fist. "Open this door right now," she shouted. "We need to talk." I opened the door calmly, still holding my coffee cup. "Good morning, Karen," I said. "How can I help you?" Her face was red with anger and she was practically vibrating with rage. "You need to take that billboard down immediately," she said. "This is harassment. This is defamation. I am going to sue you for everything you have." "Actually," I replied, "everything on that billboard is completely factual. That is your SUV, your license plate, and my property. The date and time are accurate. I have video evidence of every claim." "I do not care what evidence you think you have," she said. "You cannot put my personal information on a public billboard. This is illegal." I pulled out my phone and showed her the legal opinion that Sarah Chen had provided. According to my attorney, Documenting factual information about illegal activity is completely legal. You have been trespassing on my property for over a month, causing significant damage. The billboard is simply making that information public." Karen stared at the phone screen, her anger gradually shifting to something that looked like panic. "You recorded me without my permission," she said. "That is invasion of privacy." "You were on my property without my permission," I replied. "That is called trespassing. There is no expectation of privacy when you are committing crimes on someone else's property." She stood there for a moment, apparently trying to think of another argument. Then she pointed her finger directly at my face. "I am on the HOA board," she said. "I will make your life miserable. I will find violations with your property. I will fine you for every little thing." "Feel free to try," I said. "But I think you are going to be pretty busy dealing with your own problems. Have you checked your phone lately? Or Facebook? Or the neighborhood app?" Her expression changed again as she realized what I was suggesting. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through her social media notifications. I could see her face growing paler as she read. "The QR code on the billboard links to a website with all the video footage," I explained. "People have been sharing it all morning. You are becoming quite famous in the neighborhood." Karen looked at her phone, then at the billboard, then back at me. For the first time since I had known her, she appeared to be speechless. She stood there for several seconds, mouth open, trying to process what was happening. "This is not over," she finally said. "I am calling my lawyer. I am calling the police. I am calling the billboard company. You cannot do this to me." "You did this to yourself," I replied. "Every single day for over a month, you chose to drive across my property. You chose to damage my lawn. You chose to ignore my requests to stop. You chose to escalate the situation instead of simply driving on the public street like everyone else." She turned around and stormed back to her SUV, but before she could drive away, a police car pulled up behind her. Officer Martinez got out and approached both of us. "We received several calls about a disturbance," he said. "Is there a problem here?" Karen immediately started talking, explaining that I was harassing her with a defamatory billboard and that she wanted to file a complaint. Officer Martinez listened patiently, then asked to see the billboard and the video evidence. After reviewing everything, he turned to Karen. "Ma'am, based on this evidence, it appears that you have been repeatedly trespassing on this gentleman's property. The billboard appears to be factually accurate documentation of illegal activity. I would recommend that you contact your attorney to discuss your legal exposure." Karen stood there looking stunned as Officer Martinez explained that she could face criminal charges for trespassing and civil liability for property damage. Her morning had started with her usual routine of cutting across my lawn, and it was ending with a police officer explaining why she might be facing legal consequences. As she finally drove away, I noticed that traffic was already backing up on Maple Street as people slowed down to look at the billboard and take photos. My phone was buzzing with notifications from neighbors who had seen the billboard and wanted to share their own stories about Karen's behavior. The billboard would be up for 30 days, but I had a feeling that its impact would last much longer than that. The billboard had been up for exactly 1 week when I received a call from David Patterson, the HOA president. He asked if I could attend an emergency board meeting scheduled for the following evening. He would not tell me what the meeting was about, but his tone suggested it was serious. I arrived at the community center at 7 o'clock sharp. The parking lot was fuller than I had ever seen it for an HOA meeting. Usually these meetings attracted maybe 8 or 10 people, but tonight There were at least 50 cars in the lot. I had a feeling that word about the billboard had spread throughout the entire neighborhood. Inside, the meeting room was packed. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. I recognized most of the faces as neighbors from the surrounding streets, but there were also people I had never seen before. Everyone was talking excitedly, and the energy in the room felt electric. David called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. We are here tonight to discuss the recent situation involving board member Karen Mitchell and the public allegations of property damage and trespassing. Karen was sitting in the front row, looking smaller and more subdued than I had ever seen her. She was wearing a conservative business suit and had her hair pulled back severely. She looked like someone preparing for a job interview or a court appearance. David continued, "We have received dozens of complaints from neighborhood residents about Mrs. Mitchell's behavior, both regarding the lawn damage and other issues dating back several years. The board has conducted a thorough review of her actions and conduct." One by one, neighbors stood up to share their own stories about Karen's abuse of her HOA position. Mrs. Henderson talked about the ridiculous violation notices she had received for having her newspapers delivered too early. The Johnson family described how Karen had tried to get their dog removed from the neighborhood for barking during normal daytime hours. The Martinez family explained how she had threatened them with fines for growing tomatoes in their backyard. The stories went on for over an hour. Pattern after pattern of bullying, intimidation, and abuse of power. Karen had been using her position on the HOA board to make life miserable for anyone who crossed her or failed to meet her personal standards. When the testimony was finished, David announced the board's decision. Effective immediately, Karen Mitchell is removed from her position on the HOA board. Additionally, the board is implementing new policies to prevent future abuse of authority and ensure that all board members are held accountable for their actions. Karen stood up and walked out of the meeting without saying a word. I watched her leave and felt a mixture of satisfaction and relief. Justice had finally been served. But the story was not over yet. 2 days later, I received a call from Sarah Chen, my attorney. Karen's lawyer had contacted her with a settlement offer. Karen would pay for complete restoration of my lawn, including new sod, topsoil, and professional landscaping. She would also pay for my security camera system and reimburse me for the cost of the billboard. In total, the settlement was worth over $6,000. In exchange, I would agree to take down the billboard early and not pursue criminal charges for trespassing. It was a generous offer, and I accepted it immediately. The lawn restoration took place the following week. Karen hired a professional landscaping company to completely redo my front yard. They removed all the damaged grass, brought in fresh topsoil, and installed beautiful new sod. They also repaired my flower beds and replaced the border stones that had been damaged. When the work was finished, my lawn looked better than it had ever looked before. The grass was thick and green, the edges were perfectly straight, and the flower beds were filled with colorful plants that would bloom throughout the spring and summer. More importantly, the neighborhood had changed. People were talking to each other more, sharing information about HOA policies and board meetings. The community felt more connected and engaged than it had in years. Karen's abuse of power had inadvertently brought everyone together in opposition to bullying and intimidation. I learned several important lessons from this experience. First, documentation is everything. Without the photos and video evidence, it would have been impossible to prove what Karen was doing.